Well, we're starting on several brand new projects.
And one of them's really intimidating.
This has been one of those ones, I mean, going all the way back to when, we were first envisioning the railroad. Right here is supposed to be a turntable.
Yes.
And it's, I'd say, physically the largest thing I've ever undertaken, but one of the most complicated things, too.
Yeah, I don't even, I'm just, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll just dive in at this
Right.
point, because right now it's the elephant in the room. It's get her done.
Right.
So over here is the other part of the engine shop, and if you've been following along on the channel, this whole area has now been completed.
Right.
And that needed to be completed before we could move on to this, the turntable.
Oh, I thought it was a roundy round down there in Bloomington.
The circus minimus. Anyway, it seems almost kind of strange to have this whole end of the engine shop completed down to the nuts, bolts, and gaskets, and then having the whole thing just sort of run off into a plywood desert.
Yeah, and it could happen for real.
If a train came down here, it would run off onto the plywood desert, that's for sure.
I worry every time one toots its horn.
And this is one of the other projects that we're going to be working on. This K36 has been, an ongoing project for over 10 years. And but it's kind of the deciding factor on the turntable, because it needs to be able to fit on the turntable, and as it's the largest locomotive that we have, it kind of sets the standard here for how big the turntable's going to be.
Right, so if it'll turn on that, anything will turn.
And not too surprisingly, that was also the case on the actual Rio Grande narrow gauge, that they had some of these locomotives. This is the K37, and the K37 and 36 meant that Rio Grande had to rebuild all of their turntables into 65-foot turntables.
Whoa.
And tear out all of their 55-foot turntables.
I see.
Because they're just that much bigger. And these two locomotives just barely fit on one of these turntables. In fact, the front and back of the locomotive hangs over the edge a little bit.
Yes, it does.
This is the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, Colorado, and a few years ago they built a 65-foot turntable, and there's a couple of things about this that are quite different from the standard Rio Grande turntable. Not the least of which is it has no electric motor to drive it.
Oh.
It's what we euphemistically call an Armstrong turntable. You just grab a hold of these big long arms and give a mighty shove.
Yes, it looks like they're really exerting themselves too.
Boy, once it gets moving, getting it to stop.
That's the whoops. Yep, that's the trick.
First it's hard to get it going, and then it's really hard to get it to stop.
That's when you need your cowboy boots.
But not too surprisingly, this was standard practice on a lot of railroads. It's actually pretty simple to rotate a locomotive entirely by hand.
Yeah.
But there are a couple of other things about this turntable that are rather unique. It certainly isn't your standard Denver and Rio Grande 65-foot turntable. For one thing, it's a dual gauge turntable, because here at the museum they have both standard gauge and narrow gauge locomotives that they want to take into the roundhouse. And so it actually has 4 rails on the deck. The outer 2 are standard gauge, the inner 2 are 3-foot gauge, so that they can pull either gauge of locomotive onto the turntable. But the thing that really jumps out to me is how much heavier the bridge structure is. These I-beams, the big support beams that make up the turntable bridge, are much taller in the middle, much heavier, and it's virtually flat across the bottom, where the average Rio Grande turntable is curved all the way across the bottom. This is, of course, the turntable at Durango on the Durango and Silverton, and is in fact an old Denver Rio Grande turntable. So this is the exact item right here. The entire turntable pit is dished on the bottom, and the shape of the bridge mirrors that exactly. And I think this was done primarily for drainage reasons. Water is going to accumulate in here, and this way you can have all the water run toward the center, and then you can have a drain there. This is, of course, a K36 locomotive, which is the same thing we have on our railroad. A heavier locomotive on the railroad would have been the K37 as well, which surprisingly, although it's a bigger, heavier engine, it's actually a few inches shorter than this one. But these larger locomotives are the reason why the Rio Grande tore out all of their 55-foot turntables and replaced them with 65-foot turntables. And these locomotives just barely fit on there. In fact, they overhang at both ends. Needless to say, the tracks need to align perfectly at both ends of the turntable when the turntable comes to a stop, so that the locomotive can smoothly pull on and off of the turntable bridge. And this has me a little concerned. The number one problem, as I see it, is getting the height of the bridge exactly correct so that the rails line up perfectly and aren't slightly higher or lower than the bridge. And I can see where if I construct the bridge being very, very, very careful to make it exactly correct, when I put it in place, it's not going to line up. So I'm thinking I want to build in some sort of an adjustment here so that once the bridge is in place, if it's not lined up perfectly, I can raise or lower the end of the turntable just slightly. I've always found locomotive shops to just be sort of a fun and interesting place.
Well, I do too, despite the fact, some people would say a girl doesn't, But it reminds me of going into places where you shouldn't go when you're a kid.
Well, yeah. And I, the people working in here, I'm sure, don't say, well, it's a very relaxing experience. But I just love being in here.
Oh, I do too. I mean, it's like, you can have a cup of coffee, sit back and look at the trains.
I'd set up a folding chair and just spend the whole day here.
Right.
I mean, why not? It's just, there's just something magical about it, especially in some of these shops where they just let you go in there and wander around like they do at Ely, Nevada.
Right. And when you're our age, they're not yelling at, hey, get out of here, like when you're a kid.
You can tell by the track design and everything that the turntable is the actual heart of the facility.
Right.
And all of these tracks, all of the rest of the facility here is all just kind of a subset of the turntable.
Right.
All the tracks radiate out from that central point. What all this means is the very center of the facility is the turntable. So let's take a quick look at how the turntable works, how the prototype works. It's supported on both ends by a rail which runs around inside the pit. And the entire bridge is simply suspended between these two rails. There's no support in the middle. There is a pivot in the middle, but as far as I know, it provides no support. All of the weight of the locomotive is carried on the ring rail that goes around the outside of the pit. Jerry Day has posted, a couple of thousand photographs on the internet, and in 2019 he was able to get pictures of the entire mechanism here so that we can see how it works. There are two wheels underneath the bridge at each end, and at one end there's a pneumatic motor that turns those wheels, which will cause the turntable to rotate around in the pit. The extreme weight of the locomotive provides enough downforce to ensure good traction on the ring rail so that this motor can quite easily actually turn the turntable bridge around inside the pit. There's quite a gear reduction here so that the motor itself is turning at a much higher speed. Here we can see the mechanism removed from the turntable bridge. There's a single large wheel here that rides on the ring rail and moves the bridge around inside the pit. I'm not going to try to model that or or power my turntable pit from the outside edge, but in this scale I have seen it done. I'm not going to do it that way. Now here we can see just how narrow the bridge actually is. The reason for that is these big support beams are directly underneath the rails, so that the weight of the locomotive is pressing directly down on these large beams that make up the bridge. And then very long ties are laid on top of that, and the rails spike down to the ties. And then planking can be put down on top of the ties here, the cross ties, so that there's a walkway for the crew. There are kits available in the smaller scales. One thing about this one, you'll notice that the powering for the bridge is at the center pivot, not out on the outside ring rail as it would be on the prototype. And that's exactly what I'm planning to do too, is power it from the center. Here's an article from the Narrow Gauge Annual from several years ago, quite a few years ago, about a person who built a 120.3 scale turntable, but he did choose to power it from motors built into the bridge and wheels at both ends of the bridge. And he's got 2 support wheels at each end of the bridge as well. It's really amazing construction. It's all soldered brass and machined on a milling machine and so on. And while this is really fun to read about this, and I gathered great inspiration from it, I wouldn't even dream of undertaking something like this. It has 2 motors that turn in opposite directions built into the bridge, as well as this little box in the middle here is a sound system. Here we can see the dish in the bottom of the turntable bridge and the drain at the very center. I'm going to put about 3/4 of an inch of dish in my turntable pit. It's a little less than prototype, but it'll make modeling it a lot simpler. I'm going to power it from the very center pivot using timing belts and an electric motor, a much simpler system than trying to actually power it in a prototypical manner by motors inside the bridge. The mathematics is a little bit complicated. A lot of what I'm using is metric, some of it's imperial, and I've got to make all kinds of conversions. And I've decided to make the math even more complicated by using a Sharpie and doing all the math on a napkin. Okay, on to the turntable pit. Years ago, when I roughed out the area for the pit, I made that 4 by 4 feet on the assumption that I would just use half a sheet of plywood. And so we went out and purchased furniture grade plywood to at least start construction on the pit. The pit is 39 inches across, and so that leaves an extra 9 inches of wood, or in other words, 4.5 inches at each end of the turntable pit. The front edge of the benchwork is going to be cut to a more or less matching curvature to the turntable pit, but because it's the full width of the 48-inch plywood, it's going to be a slightly different radius. This is how it is supported at the edges. This L girder runs around on 3 sides and is very strong and should be able to support all of this weight. But as I start figuring out putting a 40-pound locomotive on here plus the weight of the wood, I'm going to reinforce this with some steel brackets. The base of the turntable here is 3/4 inch furniture grade birch plywood. And that makes the depth of the turntable pit from the top of the ties on the railroad to the top of the birch plywood support exactly 4 inches. And that means that the scale depth is 81 inches or 6.75 feet, which is a bit deeper than I want. The outside edge of the turntable pit seems to be right around 30 inches, something like that. There will be another layer of plywood here, which is the actual a support for the ring rail that goes all the way around. The ties will set on top of this and the rail on top of that. And that reduces the depth of the pit to 3¼ inches, or a scale 65 inches. Now, I thought if I add another layer of plywood and put the support for the ring rail on top of that, that gives more of a taper to the bottom of the pit, which might be nice, and reduces the depth of the turntable pit to just 4.2 feet. And that's probably good enough. So here's what the entire support structure will look like in cross section. So the very first thing I need to do is mark out where everything's going to go and cut the front edge of the support, the base for the turntable here. So I've got some radiuses to figure out here, a center to mark, and then I'm going to fire up the saber saw and cut that front edge. And so with a good deal of trepidation, I will press on with utmost dispatch. And hopefully everybody's going to want to follow along with that.
Oh, yeah.
And so if you're new to the channel, or if you just simply have never subscribed, subscribe.
Absolutely.
Because you're going to want to follow along with all of that. And the easy way to subscribe is by clicking on the upcoming blue button. Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Tuesday. We'll see ya.
We'll see ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.